Hi, families! Today I am going to read you the story, The First Step, How One Girl Put Segregation on Trial. Now, this was actually a book that came from our curriculum and was included in the very first unit that we did. I don't believe we actually had a chance to read the story in class, though, but I know that students, you loved the Ruby Bridges story, and you actually asked for it to be read a couple times. So I'm going to read this book today to talk about how the school system has changed. And it's kind of an interesting story because you can kind of relate to it a little bit now with the closure from the coronavirus. So let's take a look. Again, this story is called The First Step. It is by Susan Goodman, and it's illustrated by E.B. Lewis. I'm going to have to move my face around a little bit while I read because the words move around on the page. So forgive me in advance. So Sarah Roberts was 4 years old when she started school in April of 1847. Even though it was spring, icy winds still wailed off of Boston Harbor near Sarah's home. She was lucky her school was so close by. Sarah dashed past the hay sellers and carpenters, the organ makers and oystermen. After crossing Causeway Street, she was just steps from the Otis School. The Otis was one of Boston's best, with more books than most kids had ever seen. Sarah practiced her sums and letters. She memorized poems. She spent recess in the play yard with her classmates. Then one day, a policeman walked into Sarah's classroom. He took her out of school and said she could never come back. Ever. So, thinking about this extended closure, we were all sent home until we couldn't come back for a long time. So I just want you to think about how you would feel if someone said you could never come back, ever. Feels pretty bad. The Otis School was only for white children. Sarah must have been surprised and frightened when she was forced out onto the sidewalk. But Boston had a rule that said African American children must go to a separate school for them. Sarah's parents hated this unfair decree and had enrolled her in the Otis anyway. Once the people in charge of the city schools realized what had happened, they threw Sarah out. Her parents weren't surprised or frightened. They were angry. Adeline and Benjamin Roberts tried to imagine Sarah's walk to the Smith School, which was for African American children. She would have to zigzag through many streets, crossing one neighborhood after another. Sarah would have to go all that way for a school that never taught subjects like history or drawing. All that way for Boston's only school without a play yard. No recess. A school that only owned one book. Every day Sarah would pass 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 schools she could not enter. Sarah's father had taken this trip when he was a boy. He knew exactly how it felt to look up at all those windows filled with white children, and how it felt when the children looked down on him. No child should ever feel that way again, certainly not his Sarah. Her parents stepped up to fight for change. Sarah's great-grandfather was a soldier in the Revolutionary War, fighting to free Americans from the unfair laws. Students needed a different kind of warrior. Sarah needed a different kind of warrior for this time. One whose battlefield was a courtroom. A lawyer fighting to convince judges that this rule must be changed. Sarah's parents picked Robert Morris to be her champion. Morris was the second African American lawyer in the entire United States. He was new at his job. In fact, he had taken only one case to court before, but he had won. It took Morris more than 2 years to get Sarah's case to the most powerful court in Massachusetts. He knew it was her only chance of winning. As Sarah's trial grew near, Robert Morris asked another lawyer to join him. Charles Sumner despised the way his country treated African Americans. What's more, he had a special gift. He was a great speaker. When Sumner talked about justice, he could touch people's hearts. On December 4th, 1849, a heavy snow blanketed the city. Even a ferocious blizzard wouldn't have stopped people from flooding into the courthouse. So many of them were African American, dock workers and washerwomen, barbers and blacksmiths, giving up a day's pay to be there. Some were lucky enough to get a seat. Others were willing to stand for hours if need be. Sarah's story was their story too. Her case seemed to be changing things already. It was the first case asking our legal system to outlaw separate schools. It was the first time an African American lawyer argued before a Supreme Court. It was also the first time an African American lawyer and a white lawyer teamed up to fight for justice. These three important steps forward. Sarah and her family sat in front, dressed in their finest. Spectators buzzed all around them until the judges filed in and were seated. Robert Morris had been Sarah's voice from the beginning. He spoke first here, too. He presented the facts of her case, including the two most important. Boston's rule said that students should go to the school nearest their homes, yet Sarah's skin color meant that she must cross the city to reach hers. Anyone looking at Sarah could imagine how long that journey would feel. In a grown-up's chair, her legs were too short to reach the floor. Charles Sumner's long speech lay on the table, but he barely looked at it as he spoke. All men are created equal, says the Declaration of Independence, Sumner stated. All men are born free and equal, says the Massachusetts Bill of Rights. Education in Boston is brought to every white man's door, but it is not brought to every black man's door. He is obliged to go for it, to travel for it, to walk for it, often a great distance. Even worse, Sumner said, African American children are forced into a school for themselves alone. Any school that sets race apart cannot be as good as one where all children come together as equals as promised by Massachusetts law. Sumner's clear voice rang through the courtroom. This little child asks at your hands her personal rights. Everyone knew that if Sarah got her rights, so would every other African American child in Boston. After 4 long months, the judges announced their decision. All that work, all that hope, and Sarah had lost. It was a giant step backward. So many people felt angry and helpless because the judgment was final, for the time being. Every big change has to start somewhere. Sarah's father crossed the state asking people to sign petitions that said all children, no matter the color of their skin, should be able to attend their neighborhood schools. Sarah's story inspired other African Americans to push for their rights. People passed around copies of Charles Sumner's speech. They started using an important new phrase, equality before the law. More petitions went out and more names flooded in. When all the demands were delivered to the state house, politicians began talking too. Sarah's case had lost in court, but her case had won when people, black and white, stood together and said, no more. Now, right now, is time for change. In 1855, Boston stepped into the history books as the first major American city to officially integrate schools. Over time, other cities followed Boston's example. Not all of them, though. They didn't have to. Back then, every state could make its own laws about this issue. The march toward justice is a long, twisting journey. 3 steps forward, 1 step back. One step forward, three back. Laws change and the march forward. Laws change and the march moves forward. People resist change and the march slows to a standstill, waiting for a better time. Then at last, ideas have changed enough and people have changed enough. Finally, the march cannot be stopped. In 1950, about 100 years after Sarah's legal defeat, another girl and family said, "No more." 8-year-old Linda Brown had to cross a dangerous train yard in Topeka, Kansas, walk 6 blocks to a bus stop, then ride all the way to her elementary school. A better school, named, oddly enough, after Charles Sumner, was a mere 7 blocks from her home. It was for white children only. This time, however, the Brown family was one of 200 families from several states who joined together to stop segregation in schools for the whole country. They were organized by a group called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. All these people worked together for years, joining the spirit of everyone who had fought for this cause in the past century. This time the case was heard by the country's most powerful court, the Supreme Court of the United States. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court announced its decision. All 9 judges agreed with Charles Sumner. Separating children because of their races generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Separate schools can never be equal, declared the judges. They must be outlawed in every state in the land. It is so ordered. When the gavel slammed down at the end to end the court that day, it announced change all over the country. And in its echo, you can hear the sound of Sarah's first steps to school and her long road to justice. Now, here at the very end, I'm going to see if I can get myself out of the way here. It's hard to see. There is a timeline which shows all of the events which have led up to today, 2014, when this book was published. Different rulings, different decrees, different civil rights acts, and then 2014 was the 60th anniversary of that final Supreme Court decision. I think if this book were to be rewritten, I feel like 2020 would be on the timeline. So anyways, I just wanted to share this story because I felt like it was relatable in the fact that we've been told we can't go back to schools for now, but also expresses the challenges faced in race issues in the United States. I hope you liked the story. I got very emotional, and I'm sorry for that. But it is a good historical story, and I just really wanted to share it with you. So I hope you guys have a great day. Remember, we have a Zoom call today, or a Google Meet today at 5. I miss you. I hope to see some of your faces tonight, and have a great, great morning and afternoon.